Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm John Levison, I'm director of the Mandel Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this spotlight session on Daf Yomi. At the Mandel Center, we are committed to developing and promoting scholarship in Jewish education in order to make a deep and lasting difference on the lives of learners and the vibrancy of the Jewish community. This session and our other events are one of the ways that we serve our mission by getting ideas out into the world. I encourage you to visit the Mandel Center's website for more information about our various events. Our spotlight sessions are different than the other kind of session that we've been running recently. We call those our learning about learning sessions. In that series of events, we focus on one particular research project or one particular paper for about 30 minutes. But in this series, in the Spotlight series, we tackle a topic in Jewish education more broadly, and we do it with a group of panelists rather than just one person. And of course, we give ourselves a little bit more time. So we'll have an hour and a quarter to dive into our topic today, and we'll wrap up at 2:15 Eastern Time. We're using a webinar format, but you can submit questions to us. We encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And this session will be recorded, and we'll make the recording available afterwards for anyone who wants to see it. But the participants will be on the recording, but the audience won't be on the recording. As you all know, our topic today is Daf Yomi. You probably also know that Daf Yomi is the practice of studying a page of Talmud each day, or really 2 pages, a folio, both sides of a page. And of course, it's particularly important that the practice is organized around a cycle, kind of a synchronized cycle of about 7.5 years, which means that everyone who is studying Daf Yomi is quite literally on the same page. They're studying the same page of Talmud with the same topics and the same confusing arguments and the same profound insights and the same wild stories and everything else that the Talmud contains. Daf Yomi is also a product of a particular historical moment in 2 different senses. First of all, unlike pretty much any other educational practice that I can think of, we know exactly when Daf Yomi began. It was proposed by Rav Meir Shapiro at a conference in August of 1923, and it was launched on Rosh Hashanah that year, September 11th, 1923, so just about 100 years ago. And second, Daf Yomi is a product of our contemporary historical moment, which has seen an unbelievable explosion of the practice, both among those who traditionally participated in the past, and especially among new groups of people who did not traditionally participate in Daf Yomi, or for that matter, in the study of Talmud at all. And the explosion of the practice in the 21st century has also been accompanied by an explosion of ways of doing the daf, just an astonishing variety of technologies and methodologies. And those are some of the reasons why it's so interesting and so worth our time and attention today. We've brought together a great group of people to share their thinking about Daf Yomi. Let's bring them all onto the screen. And let me introduce them very, very briefly. We'll put up a link in the chat so that you can learn more about each one of them. So just in alphabetical order, we are joined today first by Jane Kanarek, who's a professor of rabbinics at Hebrew College, where she's also an associate dean. Avi Killip, who is the executive vice president at Hadar, New York City. Barry Wimpheimer, who is a professor of religious studies at Northwestern, and Sarah Wolkenfeld, who is the chief learning officer at Sefaria. And we will get the links up. Great, the links are up in case you want to learn more about our wonderful panelists. So let's begin. Let me begin by asking each of you, I'll call on each of you in turn, to tell us a very little bit about your Talmud autobiography. I know that for each of you, this could be a very, very long story. But for now, let's hear the very, very brief version of your Talmud biography and what connection you have to Daf Yomi. So Jane, why don't you get us started?
Thanks so much, John. Very brief version of my Talmud autobiography. I first studied the Talmud in college. First page of Brachot in the Sukkah with friends during Sukkot. I fell in love with it, both because of its mystique and because it was probably the deepest intellectual challenge I'd ever faced, and because intellect and spirit are profoundly connected for me. So Talmud checked all the boxes. I went on to study in Israel and received rabbinic ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. I did a PhD in rabbinic literature. And currently I teach Talmud, which is one of my teaching love. And I also research Talmud pedagogy. My connection to Daf Yomi is really twofold. I finished it in the last cycle. I can't say I enjoyed it, but that's a separate story. And I've also done a bit of research on Daf Yomi as well, which really gave me a deeper appreciation for the practice.
Nice. So I love the fact you've already put out the idea that doing Daf Yomi can be the occasion of a certain kind of spiritual discipline, which doesn't necessarily mean that you're loving every minute of it, right? That's not how, when we think about spiritual disciplines, it's not rainbows and unicorns all the time. Avi Killip, tell us about your Talmud autobiography.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be in this conversation. So I grew up as a day school kid in Atlanta. So I did learn some Talmud in high school, but I really first learned Talmud in a real way, I would say, after graduating from Brandeis, when I started to seek out opportunities to learn Talmud. So my first really serious Talmud study was in 2007 at a tiny kollel at Ramah, Wisconsin, where I got to learn actually from Rabbi Jane Kanarak, where there was a young Israeli counselor who taught a staff Daf Yomi class after dinner on Masechet Makot. So it was pretty short. We could finish the whole thing in one summer. And that was my first Daf Yomi experience. I probably understood very little of what was actually on the daf, but I loved that feeling, that taste of accomplishment of having seen an entire Masechet. I actually began learning Daf Yomi. I went to rabbinical school and also learned more Talmud more seriously at Hebrew College. I started learning Daf Yomi on the cycle in 2012 at a time that sort of shocks everybody when they hear about it, which is right when my first son was born. So I was just turning 28 and I was totally sleep deprived and I couldn't actually focus on the in-depth Talmud study that I was supposed to be doing in school. And I discovered Rabbi Yitzchak Et Shalom's Daf Yomi podcast. And I listened to that podcast every day for the next 7 years, basically. I had this vision that if I stuck with it, I could make a siyum on Shas when my son was in first grade, who had just been born. And I did get to do that, which was actually incredibly rewarding. I didn't imagine it would be in midst of pandemic, but it did pan out in that I got to finish. I would say, maybe differently from Jane, Daf Yomi, I would say, was so much more than just a learning practice. It really became a part of my identity that I carried around. It's like as a voice that was always in my head and who I was in the world. And then the last thing I'll just add is that I'm dyslexic. And so I'm also very much an auditory learner, which has played a tremendous role in my relationship to Talmud and my relationship to Daf Yomi in particular, which I'm happy to say more about later, but just to say that I very much think of Talmud as an oral Torah practice. And I think of that as actually an authentic way, as opposed to a podcast being a newfangled way of engaging with Talmud. I think of actually absorbing it orally as a very authentic way to learn these texts.
Yeah, great, thank you. So, podcasting is, so it's a new technology. In one sense, it's not radically different than, I don't know, a cassette. On the other hand, the distribution technology means that you could actually get it every day, which you kind of need to do if you're going to actually carry out the practice on a regular basis. Barry, tell us about your Talmud autobiography.
So I grew up in the Orthodox community and I had a yeshiva day school background. But surprisingly, the first time I studied Talmud wasn't in yeshiva, it was in summer camp. Summer of fourth grade, I was in an all boys summer camp and in upstate New York. And we had lots of daily learning, and I was exposed to Talmud at that point. And I had what I would call is an immersive Talmud education in elementary school through middle school and high school. But I didn't necessarily, I had a lot of facility with Talmud, but I didn't love the study of Talmud. So Jane was describing, loving it almost immediately. I would say for me, the falling in love, the romance of Talmud began when I was in yeshiva in Israel after high school, when I began to be exposed to a more historicized and critical version of Talmud than I had been exposed to previously. And that just excited me. I mean, I'm going to again refer back to what Jane said, is the kind of connection between intellect and spirit, that the idea that something could be intellectually satisfying, there could be a puzzle that you could spend your time working on, and then you could maybe come up with a solution, and maybe it would be a completely original solution that nobody had ever thought of. And you were also doing something that was religiously mandated in a group of fellow religious people. It was a kind of intoxicating experience. So my yeshiva experience, I spent 3 years in that yeshiva. I spent 4 years in rabbinical school. And in all the years since, my study of Talmud has been driven by this kind of love of the intellectual challenge and the satisfaction of studying Talmud. I don't feel capable of studying Daf Yomi, because in order for me to have the kind of intellectually satisfying experience that I like in Talmud, I can't go at that pace. So my over the years, I have never tried to do Daf Yomi, though I can't say there hasn't been, like, every time the cycle restarts, there isn't some thought in my head, well, maybe. My father, who is in the audience today, has done the Daf Yomi for over 2 cycles now. So I feel like I have a family connection to Daf Yomi, even though I don't do Daf Yomi myself. And I wrote, because you're asking me about my biography, I also wrote this book, The Talmud, a Biography, which is a biography of the Talmud. And in it, I talk a little bit about Daf Yomi. And so I've theorized a little bit about why Daf Yomi excites people, what work it's doing, how it fits with other aspects of Jewishness and Judaism. And I'm happy to talk more about that today.
Great. So just to kind of tease out something that I think was implicit in what you said, Barry, there have been moments when Daf Yomi has been an unfavored mode of engagement with Talmud in the Jewish cultural arena. It was kind of second class compared to kind of real Talmud study. And maybe it still is in certain settings, but it also feels like something has changed, that it has become, you said something about feeling badly, that you're not capable. I'm guessing, if we had this conversation 15, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have said that you feel badly about not studying Talmud. You probably wouldn't be proud of it, about not doing Daf Yomi. You're not a Daf Yomi kind of person. You're an in-depth kind of person. Something like that. Sarah, over to you. Tell us about your Talmud autobiography.
Sure, I'm super happy to be here, and this is a really fun question. I will pick up from where Jane and Barry started to go and say that my Talmud autobiography is definitely a love story. I started learning Talmud when I was in 7th grade. It was introduced as a subject in school, and I just loved it from day one. I had a creative and thoughtful teacher. I was drawn to the intricate arguments and the characters of the rabbis who grappled with and modeled the kind of lived reality of dealing with Jewish ideas and Jewish law. And I related to it in a way that Bible and the other topics that I had learned in school before never spoke to me in quite the same way. I was a good student in those subjects, but I definitely fell in love with Talmud. And I think that love only intensified as the Talmud and I got to know each other better. I would also say that my opportunities for studying Talmud are not to be taken for granted, because I grew up as a modern Orthodox girl and young woman, and I think can do another panel on that. But I never missed the opportunity to express gratitude to my parents and my teachers for making this passion possible. And I really didn't know in a real way, I didn't know until I was 18 and in yeshiva in Israel that the Talmud study wasn't a regular part of all the other women's lives that I was seeing around me. I didn't really know. I had the sense that it was almost like the vote for women, that like once upon a time you couldn't do this thing, and then everyone saw the error of their ways, and now we could all do this thing. And I really didn't know that that wasn't true. And so I think my first encounter with Daf Yomi was hearing my teacher in yeshiva, my Gemara teacher, say, similar to what Barry said, Daf Yomi is for the people who don't really learn Torah. That's not you. That's not us. That's not this class, the top class in this yeshiva. And so we will not be learning Daf Yomi. And so I didn't for a really long time. And I would say it's only in the last a little less than 20 years that I've had any contact with Daf Yomi. And at first it really just came about when I was needed, like someone else wanted to learn Daf Yomi and I was around to support. And that's how it started. I didn't quite jump on the bandwagon in the same way that Avi did, but I will say that for me, the times when I personally started to learn Daf Yomi, and I was always in and out of the cycle, were in those moments when regimented daily learning, counting off days, seemed really attractive. And for me, that was during pregnancies. And so I know which tractates I completed while pregnant with which children. But again, it wasn't really a big part of my life. And I think that this last Daf Yomi cycle has been a turning point, and that was really because of the Women's Siyum in Jerusalem in January of 2020, which I was able to attend. Safaria co-sponsored the program, and that felt like the fulfillment of a lifetime of dreams in a lot of ways, of going back to being told when I was 18 that women don't really do this, and then looking around and seeing that there were thousands of women doing this, and that felt like a really important moment.
Yeah, that was an amazing. I wasn't there, but I did watch the video of that event, which was amazing. Right, it was an amazing historical kind of marker of something that would have been unimaginable not that long ago. And I'm also really intrigued, Sarah, by the idea of moving into the practice of Daf Yomi and moving out. Obviously, in some ways, it's I don't know if we can frame it as a kind of a failure, right? You start something, but you don't finish it. And there is an element of Daf Yomi. You're supposed to do the whole cycle, right? Even if, am I correct, Avi? You started mid-cycle, but then you got all the way through and completed, right?
Yeah,
So
I started with Eruvin, which I think of as a hack, actually, that I recommend to everybody, because Shabbos is when you get bogged down. But if you're 7 years in, you can't quit. So
Right. So you start wherever you start. It's like starting, 3 a.m., but then you go all the way to 3 a.m. And so in some way, if you don't complete the cycle, there's a kind of a framing of failure. But sorry, you're also noting that, but there may also be another way that it functions, where you kind of drop in something else going on in your life, like a pregnancy, which is itself kind of mind-blowing for me that would be the, kind of a marker. But, dropping into Daf Yomi as a practice that's not so much predicated on like success or failure. I accomplished the whole thing, or I fell off the bandwagon, but more like a lot of other practices that we are familiar with exercise or yoga or prayer or other things where things come up in our lives and we may be in or out. I want to encourage the audience, if they do have questions as they come up, to use the Q&A function. I'm going to keep an eye on that. But now I want to turn back to all of you, and I want to think some more about this idea of Daf Yomi as a cultural practice. And I'm not going to call on you. I'm just going to invite you guys to whoever wants to chime in. So we've already started to hear about this idea of Daf Yomi as a cultural practice. I'm not particularly interested on the best ways to do Daf Yomi or whether Daf Yomi is a good thing or a bad thing. Clearly, we've already referenced that there are ways of thinking about that question, but we're focused on a Jewish educational practice that's become part of Jewish culture. And so here I want to throw this back to you. What does it mean to you to say that Daf Yomi is a cultural practice? What do you think? Go ahead, Barry.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think that Daf Yomi is a calendrical practice, and this move of taking one of the sacred texts of Judaism and turning it into a calendar has been done before. It was done with the Torah a long time ago. And I think one question that could come out of that is if we're trying to theorize what it is about Daf Yomi that's getting people interested and what is exciting to people nowadays, and why this practice that's less than 100 years old, as John pointed out, introduced in 1923, how has it become so big so quickly? I think one of the questions is, what is the relationship between this calendrical practice and Torah reading, the cycle of Torah? Like, how is it similar and how is it different? And I think one of the aspects might be that it's providing something that's been kind of lost in the Torah calendar, which is, I think the Torah calendar was a ritualization of an originally educational practice. But over time, I don't know how many of us attend synagogue and are actually learning so much from the weekly Torah portion. It's become much more about music and much less about content. And Daf Yomi is offering something else. It's offering something that's very content heavy. It engages the mind. It doesn't have a kind of ritual formulaic nature of saying psalms or other kinds of prayers. It's engaging people's brains. Many Jews now are much more educated than they once were, and they're educated to think very deeply about lots of things. And Daf Yomi gives a space where that is now welcome. And so it's combining this traditional calendrical thing with something that's much richer.
So it's interesting to think about, you called it the music. I think you meant music both literally and also metaphorically, right? People will listen to Torah reading without necessarily thinking about the meaning of the words, it's much less about the transmission of ideas or of content, but is much more of an aesthetic experience. There's also the performative side, right? We may be performing, or maybe appreciating somebody else's performance, and maybe that's also tied in. Jane, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm actually really struck, Barry, by your description of Daf Yomi, or raising the possibility that it could fill in something that we've lost with the way in which Torah reading is done in synagogues now. And part of what I've noticed, at least in a lot of liberal synagogues, is that Torah reading has actually become a life cycle event. It's become part of the life cycle calendar rather than the yearly calendar. We call people up for aliyot, for anniversaries and birthdays, recognizing people who are sick and praying for healing. And so I wonder also if that's part of the vacuum that's been left for where's the space for actually a Jewish knowledge practice that fits into the calendar as well, because I think in the liberal world, at least, Torah reading isn't holding that space. And one of the things I've been struck by is also the spread of Daf Yomi outside of Orthodoxy. And I just feel like I meet all of these people who I would never have expected to be doing Daf Yomi to actually be doing it. Many of them are doing it in English. Many of them, Sarah, are facilitated by Safaria. So there's something larger going on as well with the democratization of knowledge. And maybe also, to throw one other thing into the mix, that it's tied into also cultural drives for belonging and spiritual practice, and that this is becoming a particularly Jewish form of spiritual practice.
Jane, since you mentioned Safaria, I'll share. I don't know if anybody knows the total number of Daf Yomi learners worldwide. I do not, but I can say that Sefaria has around 500,000 unique users a month. And we can track a little bit in terms of the numbers. So to your point, Jane, around 2/3 of our users outside of Israel identify as non-Orthodox, at least on our last user survey. And we are getting significant traffic to Talmud. At times it's a happier story than other times. If you're pro Daf Yomi, we saw a big spike in January 2020 around brachot. To Avi's point earlier, Eruvin was rough. Eruvin saw a drop off, but we've seen consistently, I think that in January of 2020, not only was there a spike, but it was a huge percentage of Sefaria's traffic was actually it made Talmud, I think, like the number one. I think brachot was the number one text on our site, in use on our site in January of 2020.
So I just want to do a little bit of translation work. So what you're describing is that depending on where we are in the Daf Yomi cycle, there may be a particular tractate of Talmud which is let's say more relevant to day-to-day practice, and a tractate that may be more obscure, maybe more difficult, technical, more complicated arguments, and there may be a correlation that you have started to see in this data of where people join or where they drop off.
Yep, and I will just add, I think, Jane, you describing it as a spiritual practice, and I think that's really interesting. I think there is that element, but I also see Daf Yomi performed as somewhere like in between going to the gym and playing Wordle. There's this like discipline piece, and there's also a signaling piece. And so it's important to open up Sefaria and learn it. And then it's also important to tweet it out afterwards. And I think those two components for me are what make it really a cultural practice.
How do you feel about that performative piece?
I think it's really interesting. I think that I am in general, and maybe we'll talk about this more later, really interested in the ways that technology powers different kinds of learning and the different kinds of learning that different technologies make possible. And I think this is what we've got now. And I think it's fascinating and fun to watch.
Yeah. Avi, did you want to jump in?
I think it's like the thing that makes it a cultural practice is that it's not a study practice, it's a hobby, which is when you say like Wordle, or it's like the times that it fills in people's lives is something akin to, like, instead of watching that series on Netflix, I do Daf Yomi in the evening, or instead of listening to a particular popular podcast, like I'm doing Daf Yomi on my commute. It fits into people's lives differently. And I think if you define culture as like what's going on in the background of our lives, we live our lives like built in around and on top of the culture we're in, is that when you do Daf Yomi, the experience of it is that instead of just hearing echoes of like the novel you just read in the conversation you're having, you hear echoes of the sugya you just read. You start to hear and feel the Talmud. It really makes it into like an ongoing relationship where that is the voice, the cultural voice on which the rest of your life is layered. And then as that spreads to more people learning, then it becomes more people are like in on that, that show or like that piece of culture, where you would say, when I'm with people who understand opera, then we have the same cultural language. It's like, that's how you feel about the Daf Yomi social media.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's it's so interesting. I mean, we sometimes hear about especially in traditional Jewish circles, about the way that the study of Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, kind of illuminates life in that way. And you're pointing out that, well, once we take on a different text with a different discipline, it turns out it also has the power to illuminate life in that way, to kind of frame our cultural references.
And I would say Sarah's comment of, I know what Masechet I was learning when I was pregnant with each child. I very much identify with that, both about my actual children, but also more broadly of, I know which Masechet I was learning the day that Trump won the election, or I know what I was learning the time that George Floyd was killed. It's like, that's the background against which my life is playing out, in the same way that you would say, where were we culturally, the time that album, Beyonce's third album was when I had my second kid, is like, that's how you put those against your life pattern.
Yeah.
Now, can I ask you, Avi, can you say the same thing about Parshat HaShavua? Like, do you remember which Parsha was George Floyd?
That's a great question. That cycles through so many more times. My answer to that is yes, but only if I gave a drash that week. Like, I do remember certain parshiot. If I gave the drash that week and I remember thinking, what did this parsha have to teach about that instance? Then I do. And sometimes if somebody else gave a particularly memorable drash, I remember their Torah as well. Yeah, but it's a 7 cycle instead of a 1 cycle,
So I want to build on that by asking a question about this, the way in which Daf Yomi can function as a kind of unifier, which after all is explicitly one of the original purposes, according to Meir Shapiro, when he proposed this idea, that everyone would be, I mean, maybe this is a fantasy, but everyone would be studying the same page of Talmud. And as I think about it, I feel like it's, well, we have talked about the weekly Torah portion. Maybe that's a kind of an analog, but it almost makes Daf Yomi like must-see TV, like, back in the days when everybody watched Friends, and everybody knew the same, had watched the same episode. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the NFL playoffs is like that now. Everybody can talk about something, but that's not usually the way we think about an educational program. So I'm curious how you see that playing out of Daf Yomi as a unifier.
Maybe I'll start just really
Please.
quickly. I see it as like personal prayer practice versus communal prayer practice. It's like there are minion people and there are like leave me alone in my house with my Tillin people, and that it's like I think this is a project that appeals to people who like need that outside accountability. For sure, I never would have gotten through it in 7 years if I didn't feel like I better catch up or I'll miss the cycle. I'm on a train that's continuing to move, and I'm very much a like I need to go to Minyan if I want to dive in. Like I'm just a very like people, that's what motivates me. So I think of it as connected into that, whether it works for you or not.
Yeah, I just want to name, thank you, everyone. I just want to name something that we haven't named before, which is we talk about everybody being on the same cycle, everybody doing the daf, but of course, well, I shouldn't say of course. My sense is from conversations with a lot of people that there's plenty of lagging behind and catching up, right? So there is a schedule. The schedule is enormously important. You don't have any catching up unless you have a schedule, but you're not always on the top. You sometimes miss a few days, and then you have to scramble and carve out some time and figure out how to cover. Other thoughts about the way that it unifies? So Avi proposed that for some folks, it's there is a kind of private prayer that is not important to be unified, but maybe there is. Maybe it's about who.
I just want to state sort of the obvious that when Rabbi Shapiro began the Daf Yomi practice as a unifier, he wasn't offering that to people like me. And so I think it's really interesting to think about not just who Daf Yomi is unified, but who it can unify, and thinking about who are the people. Yes, there's this tremendous surge. Who are the people who are still outside Daf Yomi? And here I'll say that there's also been, from my vantage point, kind of an explosion of different learning calendars that are out there. I think Daf Yomi is the impetus for that. And I think that other people are looking for a way into that experience that Avi described through other texts.
So just to be explicit, Sarah, what other kinds of learning schedules are you talking about?
There's a Mishnah Yomi program that I believe just recently restarted. There's 929, especially popular in Israel, but here in the States also, that pushes you through the entire Tanakh, the entire Jewish Bible. There's a Daf Shvu'i program where you can learn a daf a week, and I don't know exactly how that breaks down per day. And so there's a number, and again, just from the Safari vantage point, where we're constantly getting emails saying, please add this learning schedule. I think there's a Aruch HaShulchan Yomi, so a legal work. There's a lot of different ones out there.
Right, so each one of them is in a way adopting the structure of Koch Classic, but and each one of them probably has a niche, and it's probably significant for particular folks, serves particular needs. I'm guessing that none of them have reached the prominence of Daf Yomi. I mean, 929 is pretty. It has gotten a lot of press, but.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes it interesting as a unifier now, especially outside the Orthodox world, is that Daf Yomi has so much support. You're like, which of the 6 podcasts do you want to listen to? And do you want to read this summary or that summary and look at these memes or those memes? Such that when I finished the cycle and I thought to myself, what should I learn next? Like, I should really embark on Midrash. That's what I really want to learn. But then it's sort of like, oh, but there wasn't an infrastructure for that. There wasn't a community. There wasn't a million memes and Facebook groups. And, I didn't sort of have that infrastructure to, like, in a way that there was the infrastructure, especially when I finished, is when everyone else in the world started. Daf Yomi is like to send you back in to start again. So that's also a really interesting, even if you break it up, right? If there aren't enough people on your schedule, does it work?
Right. So there's a question that one of the members of our audience has actually asked us to think about, well, how would you design what he calls the next Daf Yomi, but around some other Jewish knowledge practice? Do you have ideas? Like, what, Avi, if it weren't the Babylonian Talmud on its particular 7.5, have you had any ideas about, like, if it were up to you and somebody said, we need the next thing, what do you think it would be?
I'm interested to hear the rest of this group's answer. My answer is no, it needs to be Talmud, actually. That Talmud is the center document of what the Jewish people are built around. And that, Torah and then Talmud is like, that actually is the document. That's the one that resonates. And the reason it resonates so deeply is because it's been at the center of all the different conversations for all the years. And there's like something that I'm not sure it works with, like, let's study a different thing a page a day. I think it's Dafka Talmud. Yeah, I don't know. I would say I tried to layer on my Daf Yomi. I got a collection of women's poetry, and I was just reading one poem a day just to try to, like, supplement with some women's voices. And, like, poetry's so short and easy to read one a day of. But it doesn't do the same thing for you spiritually as studying Daf Yomi, not nearly.
Interesting. Other thoughts on that?
John, if I can just jump in for 1 sec also before I answer this, on the question of how does it act as a unifier?
Yeah.
One thing in the research that I did on Daf Yomi that showed up was that was really interesting was the way in which it also enabled people to kind of step into imaginative universes or imagine connections. So people talked about being connected with others outside of their local Jewish community, even if they were never going to meet those people. But it did this symbolic stand-in for them of enabling to reach beyond the community in which they were embedded, and this sense of breaking down boundaries in the Jewish world. So that was just really, really interesting for me to hear about how people were stepping into these imagined wider communities through the practice of Daf Yomi.
Yeah, it's so incredibly powerful. I mean, we can theorize about how, whenever you participate in a practice, you are connecting yourself to other practitioners, but you saw it playing out in the way that they talked about being connected to this world of people who are studying Daf.
And why they were doing it, or if they hadn't done it yet, why they'd like to do it. So that was just really, really interesting for me. To answer your question and build on what Avi said, I'm going to have 2 sides to it. One is, I don't think we've yet built the educational practices to support Daf Yomi. There's tons of material out there, but I'm really curious as well, just again from the research I did, of the range of reasons that people say they do Daf Yomi, and how could we better support people in why they're doing Daf Yomi, whether it's to have a regular learning practice, whether it's to just learn the language of the rabbis. That was a phrase that I heard. To feel like they were inside the world of the rabbis, to get a sense of what's in the Bavli. Most people didn't say it helped them learn how to actually learn the Bavli when they tried to actually dig into a sugya and follow the argument. Daf Yomi didn't facilitate that for them. So I'm just really interested in nailing down a little more what are people hoping that Daf Yomi will do, and what are the different ways in which I, as an educator, also might support my students who are doing it. But if I were to do something else, I would probably do Bereshit Rabbah. I know it doesn't have the same weight, but I think it's a wonderful companion to the Bavli to kind of get inside the world of the rabbis. I'm prejudiced probably because it's what I'm doing right now, but I would love to actually see people really engage in classical midrash and push that to the forefront as well, so that the Bavli is not the only defining thing of
Right.
Jewish literature.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating to think about what would it be like to take, I mean, on the one hand, Bereshit Rabbah is a traditional text, right? Classical midrash is traditional, but on the other hand, it's not part of the traditional curriculum in the way that Talmud is, that Barry has written about. And what would it be like to bring that in a kind of intentional way? That's a fascinating thought exercise. Barry,
Can I weigh in on the unifier and
please.
also the other practices? One of the things that I find interesting about these other practices, I think there's also, to add to the ones mentioned, I think there's like halacha yomit, where you do like a halacha of some text a day. And that one's been around for a longer period of time. I think that one's been around for 25 years or so. But I think, like, going back to what people were talking about in our cultural practice conversation, some of the cultural energy behind why people are committing to do this is particularly because of the intimidating factor of the Talmud's reputation. People think the Talmud is hard, and they know the Talmud is hard. And so the idea of doing Daf Yomi for a lot of people is like training for a triathlon. Like, yeah, you want to tackle this big reputation thing. And I don't know that everything else has the same kind of reputational pull. And I think that what motivates a lot of the other imitators is probably a like educational goal to bite off something that's actually more easily chewed than two sides of a daf every day. And these other, someone mentioned, I think in the question and answer, they mentioned someone else. Josh Culp has a Perek Yomi or something. And so there are a lot of educators out there who are trying to slow down the pace so that people can maybe get more of an educational and less of a ritual experience out of it. But I think it may be hard for anyone to really supplant Daf Yomi, because there's something about the Daf and its reputation, and the Talmud and its reputation, that's drawing people to keep trying it.
Really interesting, right? Precisely because it is so difficult, which also maybe opens up the space for the variety of what it means to do the daf. And you know, and here we get into you know, some of the judgmentalism about, you know, to really do the daf, or to do some simulation of the daf, or to do some sampling of the daf. But from my perspective, it's just fascinating to think about this explosion of different modes, different practices. You know, on the one hand, we can talk about Daf Yomi as a cultural practice, and then as soon as we do that, we have to say, well, it's actually many cultural practices. It encompasses a whole bunch of things, whether that's classes, you know, face-to-face classes, or remote classes, or the complete recitation of the daf in a kind of ritual function of saying every word, or the podcast, or the poems, or the, you know, or the daily essays, or now, of course, we have to mention TikTok. Miriam Enzovin has just in the last couple of weeks, her TikTok has just exploded in popularity. There've been a number of really fascinating articles, and itself is a fascinating thing. So how do you think about that diversity of the different modes of what it means, different technologies of what it means to actually, quote, do the daf? Avi, you gonna jump in?
I think I'm going to speak, maybe this is a little bit more meta than exactly your question, but I just feel like it's important I have to make my case for the Daf, even though you said that that's not the purpose of this panel. Is I think of the Daf as like it is a very different thing you're trying to accomplish. This gets into a little bit what Jane was saying about what's the goal. Then studying that, one way to look at it is like if you only know of studying Talmud as really digging into the intricacies of a sugya, then that's good Talmud study. And this is bad or shallow or not Talmud study, however you want to describe it. But I think like it's so useful to me to think of the language of the forest versus the trees, which is to say that if you only ever take in Gemara as a forest and you don't spend the time to ever dig into a sugya, then you have really missed the forest, right? You can't say you know a forest and you've never even actually looked at a tree up close. But it's also true, and I think it's true for many people who go through their entire life as a yeshiva student, maybe learning Gemara every week for their whole life, and they're looking so closely at the bark on each tree that they maybe didn't actually step back to see the forest. And so to me, like the act of Daf Yomi is to say, like, when I finish a masechet, can I look back and say, what was the point? Like, what is the purpose as it all comes together? What are the themes that are coming through? That then instead of Eruvin saying like, wow, that's super boring page by page, like, you know, how high should the thing be? You could step back and say, like, what I see in this is like, what does it mean to be at home? And what does it mean to be at home on Shabbat? And how do we think about boundaries and what marks boundary? It's like, then you can see all sorts of things that you actually can't see when you're just looking up close. So I think that it's like, it's just a different project to study sort of at that height or at that distance. And then I think the other thing that it gives you is this ability that anytime somebody gives me a quote of Gemara, whether I remember it at all, I have a feeling of like, this is like Hadran Alaf is the like, I'm returning to this piece. And that sort of categorically puts the whole Gemara into like, it's a familiar category. I don't have to see what's happening. I have to remind myself what's happening in this section or something, that it sort of makes it familiar in a totally different way. So I think some, like, to come back to your question of like the podcast versus the thing, I think some of that is like, yeah, if you think of Daf Yomi as familiarizing yourself with the Talmud, then there's lots of different ways to do that. And some of that is like, pick out just a piece that will stick in your mind. You know, or like just the one note. Like I took notes on all of my learning, and I would say if I could remember one thing from every daf, that would be outrageous. I could never do that, but like that's my only goal, is like one thing from every daf.
Right. So what I hear you saying, Avi, is let's maybe challenge ourselves not to think about you know, certainly not good versus bad or being deep versus being shallow, but actually what actually comes into view depending on the lens that we use. There are certain things that we can only see very, very close up, and we wouldn't want to not have the experience of close looking. And there are some things that we can only see when we pull back the lens and start to look at larger structures or larger themes. And there's only so much we can hold in our head at any one time. And to ask that. Sarah, did you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I think that, I mean, I agree. I don't think we should think about good or bad necessarily in terms of practice. And I would even maybe go a step further. And because Avi, you were talking about remembering one thing and getting this breadth of content. I think for a lot of people, it is that. I think for a lot of people, it isn't that. And it's more like the spiritual practice that Jane was describing earlier. And there's something just about being in it. And when I think about the Talmud, and I'm sort of eyeing Barry here, because I don't know if this is really going to be consistent with anything he said in his book, but when I think about one of the important functions of Talmud, maybe not the only one or the main one, I think it's about conversation, and it's about the ways that the Jews have talked about Torah ideas for a really long time. And so to me, just the fact that people feel that they're in the conversation is what's really important. And I actually don't know, I mean, I've taught Daf Yomi classes for people who they don't read the whole daf, they don't hear the whole daf, they maybe read a few lines, or they take in a bunch of memes, or they, you know, in some way are engaged with some part of the content, and it's about being part of this larger conversation. I think that to do Talmud, is to be able to engage in some of the ways that Talmudic conversation does. And I think that that is something that can encompass a large diversity of practice and also feels really authentic and important to me.
Right. So if you think about one of the things that doing the daf can mean, it is something like engaging in a conversation about rabbinic topics using rabbinic language on a regular basis, right? Which is on the one hand quite intellectual, right? You're talking about you are talking about content, but you're not talking about coverage of content or transmission of content. You're talking about engaging on a regular basis with this very particular domain, right? Which is different than Bible, and it's different than reading the newspaper. It's a very, very different thing.
And it's not all such intellectual content, right? I mean, you can pull, depending on what you pull out from a daf, I mean, we can frame it as being intellectual because we know it's in the Talmud, but you could just as easily imagine some of these things emerging from an episode of Friends. And then you wouldn't call it intellectual conversation. But again, I think it's about engaging with that material and the mode of engagement that you're prepared to argue about it, which I think like a Talmudic stance gives you a really different approach to argument than is commonly thought of, I think, in modern Western society. And so all of that, I think, is really valuable.
John, if I can just throw something in as well, is that one thing that I also noticed, again, when I was just going back over looking at these rabbinical students talking about Daf Yomi, was that Daf Yomi seemed to be most successful when the goal was not retention of material. So the people who'd had that as a goal, when they went back to actually study a daf that they'd been through in Daf Yomi and were confounded because they couldn't do the small details, were very disappointed. Those who recognized that the goal was never retention, the goal was never to be able to learn the small details of a sugya, felt better about the practice of Daf Yomi. So that was really interesting to me. The other thing that I want to note is, just in thinking about conversation, is I don't think anyone that I interviewed talked about doing Daf Yomi and Chavruta. So I think it's really hard to do Daf Yomi and Chavruta because of the volume of material that you need to learn in a day. And so, again, I think it's interesting that there are modes of Talmud study that put you really directly in relationship with another person. And I don't think that Daf Yomi does it in the same way. And again, that just brings me back to thinking more about the imagined community and the performative nature of Daf Yomi, which also came up again and again.
It's so interesting because I guess growing up in a different era of technology, I thought about Daf Yomi as something that groups of people did together, right, in a class, presumably with a rabbi, with a teacher.
But John, can I interrupt? But not with a chavruta. Right?
Not with a chavruta,
right? There's still lots of Daf Yomi classes with a teacher, but that's different than the chavruta practice.
Right, and increasingly, and I'm sure Safaria has experience with it, increasingly, this is a solitary practice, a solo practice of consumption of whatever it happens to be. An essay, a podcast, a shiur. I'm listening to it with my headphones on, or watching a Zoom on my screen, and then I need to throw in the other thing, which is the productive side, not just performative in the sense of I like to tell people that I've done Daf Yomi. That's a performative in one sense, but also what seems to be in, not to overstate it, an explosion of different ways of my doing, not just consuming somebody else's version of the daf, but actually then doing something myself, writing a poem or an essay or a TikTok or something like that. Obviously, the numbers are going to be far fewer than the people who are doing the daf, but still, it's not small. I mean, it's just kind of amazing to watch all the different ways that people say, you know what, for me, Daf Yomi is not going to just be what I hear somebody else saying. It's going to be my doing something, my producing something, my sharing something out with the world.
Can I jump in on that, John?
Please.
So I feel like there's two aspects, there's at least two, there are more than two aspects of performance that are partly fueling that. One is the relationship between performance and ritual in general, and the other is the relationship between performance and identity. And I would say the third is like some of a generational change that has happened around disclosure and the need to construct oneself by performing, right? So, you know, there are theorists of religion who talk about like how ritual is supposed to work and why ritual works. And often it's like ritual is connected with narrative and with myth, and we do something. Ritual is basically an embodied practice of narrative. We put ourselves into a position where we can experience or be one of the characters in a story, or be closer to the characters in a story by embodying it in some way.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that's going on. It's certainly, you know, part of the weekly Torah study. It's part of the Seder every year, this sort of active performance of the ritual. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's like in the Irving Goffman, you know, performance of the self, that we're always like, that part of the construction of a self is always related to performance. That depending on who you're going to be around socially, you're going to act differently. So, and then, you know, nowadays we're just more aware of that. We're more aware of the code switching has become a term that people use all the time in casual conversation. They're aware of this sort of Goffmanian basic idea. And so people, if they want something to be important to their biography that they're constructing about themselves, and their religious biography is a piece of that, for a lot of people, performance and part of performance nowadays is about sharing. Like you share everything. You share what you had for lunch on Instagram, and you share your reaction to Daf Yomi. That's just part of like how you are in the world. And if you didn't do that, you wouldn't be thought of as having that experience.
Right. I recently, yesterday, as a matter of fact, I said to some people that I was not holding in a particular sugya, and I said it with a little bit of ironic distance, as a way of signaling all kinds of things about who I am and how I relate to a tradition.
I think this comes back to what Sarah was saying of like, people just want to join the conversation, and that especially if you're not in an actual Beit Midrash, or you wouldn't be welcome in an actual Beit Midrash, or you imagine that you wouldn't be welcome in an actual Beit Midrash, that TikTok or social media is the way to join the conversation of the Jewish people. So I a little bit wonder, like, what's the difference between saying like, you should learn in order to teach, and this is performative, as opposed to like, yeah, that's the whole purpose of learning, is that you turn around and teach it, and people are teaching it to their chevra, and their chevra is their followers, and that's what that is. That it's not performative so much as just like, that's, you know, in a different world, you know, you turn around and say it to the people at your dinner table.
Right. I just want to make explicit, Avi, that you're referencing of a classical rabbinic idea of the lamod al manat lelamed, to learn in order to teach, that you seamlessly wove in there as part of what it means, as you said, what it means to learn, which may just be an older way of thinking about what we now call performative.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Sarah, did you want to jump in? I wasn't sure if you had.
I'm excited for the next question.
Next question. Okay, so one of the things that we've referred to this a little bit along the way, but we should tackle it a little more explicitly. The other kind of diversity, not just the ways that people engage with Daf Yomi, but who these people are, who the practitioners of Daf Yomi are. So most obviously, that's a question of gender. We already heard a little bit about that. And our colleague, Adam Furziger in Israel has recently been writing and speaking about this, specifically about the Israeli context and women doing Daf Yomi in Israeli context. But it's also more generally folks who would never have seen Talmud as something that they would be involved with. And it feels like something has really changed. The audience for the Talmud and for Daf Yomi specifically has really changed. So I'm curious what you see and what you think the significance is of this broadening. So Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I am excited to talk about this because I want to broaden your question even a little bit more, John. I think it's who are the unexpected practitioners of this, who gets to be part of it, who wasn't before. But I'm really interested in thinking about the technologies that power that. And you mentioned in your introduction that there couldn't be a Daf Yomi until there was a Daf. That wasn't true for a lot of the Talmud's history. And it's only because sort of the technology of the printing press and the idea of having a standardized daf kind of came together in the 16th century. So you needed there to be a daf, and you needed there to be print copies spread around in order for there to even be a Daf Yomi.
So it's both technology and also economics, right? Because you need availability of the text.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that continue to evolve. The first time that I studied Daf Yomi, I mentioned other people relying on me. So I studied with a woman. Oh, I did have a chavruta, Jane. I studied with a woman who was visually impaired, and she had a Braille reader on her computer. And the only thing she could access was the text of the Vilna Shas. She could not get a Jastrow dictionary. She could not get a Steinsaltz or an art scroll. I think those things had already been invented, but they weren't available to her. She had just the text, and anything else was going to come through some other means. And so I think that it's really interesting to think about the technologies that power this experience, and maybe what are the technologies that we still need, right? There was a question before about what else would we teach. I'm more interested in how else would we teach it, or how else could we experience this 45 minutes a day or hour a day, or whatever it is. So the Steinsaltz, the art scroll, of course, Safaria, digital availability of texts, built-in dictionaries at all, audio, to Avi's point earlier. I think that the people who are still outside the conversation, some of them might not be interested, but some of them also, we maybe haven't built the technologies for them yet, or haven't gotten those technologies to them.
So I don't disagree with anything you said, except that everything you named feels like those are all technologies for seeing close up, right? Like if I don't understand the particular phrase and I can click on it and I can get to a dictionary, or I can get to a biblical reference, that's great. But those are technologies of close seeing. What I don't think we have, and in part this is why I'm just amazed by something like Miriam Menzoven and her cultural productions, what are the technologies for pulling back the lens? Like how do we see whether it's structures or themes? I don't know of any technologies that help us to do that, kind of in the way that Avi was saying before. I think we mostly rely on individuals and what we ascribe to their own kind of creative seeing of a theme in the daf, or an idea that they want to build on or develop. Which is not to say that all those technologies are not important. I'm noticing that they don't actually help you to do the daf. They may help you to drill down on particular things.
I know you can't. Sorry, Avi.
No, you go.
You can't. You could do the daf without the Steinsaltz, but many of the people I speak to on a daily basis could not. Forget about a single phrase. They could not read a single word on the daf, in the daf, without an English translation, without punctuation, without nikud, without vocalization, right? I think we're talking about, I don't disagree with your points. I think you're right. I think that there are some technologies of the daf that have yet to be invented, but I think you can't overstate the importance of these technologies in opening up the daf. There were a few questions that came in I saw about women, and I don't know if I can answer all of them, but I would say, I don't know if I actually don't know if there's a difference between, studying the daf as a man or studying the daf as a woman, because they've only done one. But I think, the question, do women who study the daf still feel they're pioneers? I also can't answer that because I never felt that my Talmud study was pioneering, because I was so young when I started that by the time I found out that, it was too late. But I do think that most of the women who study in the Daf Yomi groups that I tap into, they would not be able to study without there being an English translation. They would not be able to study without that English translation being available to them. The Koren Steinsaltz Talmud is expensive. The Art Scroll Talmud is expensive. If you're looking for a Beit Midrash that I could walk into, you won't find that in the city where I live. And so I think that, what?
Which is a big city, Chicago.
Which is the big
Not a small
cities.
town.
The
Yeah.
greater Chicagoland area, right, doesn't have a Beit Midrash for me to even probably pull out a Jestro. So I think we need to both recognize the importance of the technologies we've built, and also, to your point, think about what else we could have.
Yeah, Jane.
This is also just where I want to do a plug for scholarship, and also really explicitly name the contrast between the democratization of knowledge that these technologies have enabled, that Steinsaltz, that Art Scroll, that Sefaria has enabled whole tons of people to access something that they couldn't. But what do I really think it takes to really get at the theme of a Masechet? I actually think it takes a lot of hard work. And I don't think that it's something that can be done through Daf Yomi. So how do we help people get in that? It's locating the books that have already been written that are taking this thematic approach to a Masechet. It's encouraging the scholarship of more of those types of works, and then figuring out how do we translate that to a wider audience. So I think what I'm also just raising here is, what's the place for the more specialized, or if I want to use a more charged term, elite knowledge, alongside this democratization of the Talmud that's going on? And how does one both support more elite knowledge, but also create conversations between the two of them? And I think that's really, really important here.
Yeah, and you know, those of us who are involved in the world of scholarship, I think we're getting better at how we translate scholarly knowledge into terms that non-specialists can understand, but there's still a long way to go, to make, you know, wonderful, wonderful insights that are developed among our colleagues in the scholarly fields actually available to what we know is a broad audience of people who could be interested in them.
I would also say it may be that you need to study an entire Masechet through Daf Yomi in order to read an article that Jane wrote on a Masechet, not in order to write the article. Like, you obviously cannot write the article because you studied Daf Yomi, but it's like, I could read an article that she wrote on a Masechet that I've never studied in depth, because I'm familiar at least with, like, what is the topic even? What is the framework? What even are we talking about? And then that would get me to the place where I could at least hear what that scholarship has to say, instead of being so far that I can make no sense of it at all. The one other tool I just want to mention is the smartphone, which is obviously needs to be paired with all of the things that Sarah is describing, but just to say that like, what you need in order to do Daf Yomi is a sheer number of hours of access to things. And whether that's like, you don't have the books, or there is a Beit Midrash, even if there was one, like, how many hours can you feasibly spend in it, is like the reason why we can talk about, like, oh yeah, nursing and Daf Yomi go really well together, is because it's like a thing I can do with one hand scrolling on Sefaria on my phone. Then that itself opens up a lot more time in life that can be devoted to this kind of learning.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Barry.
Yes. You know, the last Daf Yomi cycle, Adam Kirsch, who's a major public intellectual who writes for the New Yorker and the New York Review regularly and teaches at Columbia, he decided to do Daf Yomi and to write a regular column for in Tablet magazine online. And I think this responds both to the question of diversity and also to the question of, like, the thematic, right? So that John asked, like, what technologies exist for doing that kind of forest finding? And I think Jane answered, the technologies exist. They're people, like, they're scholars who actually do this. Right, so I think Adam is an example of someone who kind of embodies both, because he came into the study of Talmud without any background at all, any sort of traditional Jewish knowledge, and said, I'm going to do Daf Yomi and I'm going to write about it. And most of his writings were very thematic overview about what the tractates were about. If I have a fantasy about what I could do as an academic, it would be to make, I mean, I think there is a lot of stuff that we academics do with respect to the Talmud that isn't available for the Daf Yomi reader or consumer, partly because there are so few of us academics, and it takes us a really long time to work on these small passages, and so we can't keep up with the pace. So some kind of way of like meeting halfway where academics maybe can accelerate their pace of things to produce something that's more usable, I think would be great.
Right, right. It's yeah, different set of criteria. I want to. I'm looking at the clock, and this is actually kind of painful because I would love to continue this conversation for a very, very long time. I want to just name that one of the topics that we're not going to get to talk about is this, what to me is just this fascinating, fascinating combination of traditionalism and innovation that Daf Yomi represents, the way in which it is at once about, the most traditional of traditional subjects in the traditional Jewish educational curriculum, namely the Babylonian Talmud, and it is itself an innovation, a completely new practice, as opposed to lots of things which we imagine are, we kind of imagine are traditional. I don't think anybody doing Daf, well, my guess is that most people doing Daf Yomi know that this is actually something fairly new, know that this wasn't actually, given to Moses at Sinai. That's not actually how people treat this. And I wonder, it's just a question, and as I said, we won't have time to go into, I just wonder, what kind of cultural space does that open up when you imagine yourself as kind of firmly planted in a traditional world, and because you're engaging with the Babylonian Talmud, and at the same time, you're very clearly and often consciously doing something new, something that is a new thing and opens up possibilities for other corollary kinds of new things. As I said, we won't have time to drill down on that. We're running out of time, but I do want to turn to each of you for just some final thoughts. Avi, what are your final thoughts about what Daf Yomi tells us about Jewish education or Jewish culture?
Yeah, I think my final thought, I don't know, maybe Jane would disagree with this, is in an answer to John, a question you had prompted of like, why is this happening? What is the appeal? Is to say that I think our collective souls are thirsty for meaning. And I think the need that this is filling is a desire to have these voices present in our lives, that we're just so thirsty for wisdom. And the Daf just provides it freely in spades every day. There's a new Daf every day. And if you were trying to look for like a good book or a good movie or show that would give you that much depth reliably, it would be impossible to find. And the Daf is just there for us, sitting there for us, that each day it can just add meaning to your life. And I think right now people have realized that like, you're not going to find that in Netflix. It's not enough. We need something that is more deep and juicy. And like the Daf is just an ever flowing sun. Thank
you. Until Daf Yomi comes to Netflix, which I'm sure will happen, and probably within a month or two. Barry, yeah, what's your final thoughts, Barry?
Oh, well, you had mentioned this. You had mentioned this traditionalism inherent in this, and I think it's interesting that we usually think of traditionalism as something that's specifically associated with ultra orthodoxy and a kind of performance of historically outdated modes or things like that. And it's interesting to think of traditionalism without that kind of, for want of a better word, negative judgment. Traditionalism as a positive, productive, religious unifying thing. Some of this is, I think, post-Holocaust nostalgia. There's something about the Talmud as, and I talked about this a little bit in my book, the Talmud as embodying the Eastern European yeshiva and a world that no longer exists. And people feel like there's a connection there. If they can hook into Daf Yomi, then they're connecting to their Jewishness. I think that one of the things about Miriam Anzovin's stuff is she's also doing that. She's trying to connect with it and make it a matter of pride, that like she has some connection to these rabbis who lived long ago, and what they're saying can be made relevant in today's vernacular. That's that's pretty cool. And I think it's something that can be shared pretty widely as we're seeing across the Jewish spectrum.
Great, thank you. Sarah, over to you. Final thoughts about what Daf Yomi tells us about Jewish education and Jewish culture.
I think Daf Yomi tells a really interesting story about Jewish education, and it's a cliffhanger. I think we need to do this again when the cycle ends and when the next cycle begins, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in the ways that technological change can transform Jewish education. I think so often we think of that in the kind of like drilling down ways that you mentioned earlier, John, like teachers will talk about, like an app or a game or like a specific technique that you can implement. But what we're talking about is really something much bigger and much broader in terms of, like Avi said before, right? Like what can you hold in your hand and scroll through? And what kinds of experiences does that power? So I think we should think more about access. It also answers that question, like what else do I think people should study? I don't know, so many things, but the first step is going to be opening up access to those things. So I'm excited by that story. I think we need to keep tracking that story and think about what else we need to build and put out there.
Great, thank you. I feel like that you didn't even mention the word Sefaria, but that was like the mission of Sefaria, what it's brought to the world. Dane, over to you. Your final thoughts about what Daf Yomi tells us about Jewish education and Jewish culture.
I think that I find it just fascinating the way in which a book has become the anchor for so many different communities. And since a lot of the work that I do at Hebrew College is think about how do I help create community across difference through Talmud study, what might it mean for us to think about Daf Yomi as a phenomenon for creating community across difference, and what ways in which or modes might we leverage technology to actually bring together these imaginary communities and actually turn them into some form of more connected communities.
Yeah, great, wonderful. Thank you all. By way of wrapping up, I just want to mention that at the Mandel Center, we have some other events that are coming up. Our next Learning About Learning session is March 10th with Sharon Avni. We're going to be talking about her work on the Hebrew accents of American Jews. Later on in March, on the 24th, we will be launching the first book in the Mandel Brandeis series in Jewish education. This is a book called Inside Jewish Day Schools by Alex Thompson and Jack Wertheimer. I want to encourage you to sign up for our mailing list, to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. Keep an eye out for an email announcement in the next few weeks when the video from this session will be available. And mostly, I just want to thank you all for what a wonderful, wonderful conversation. We should have gone much longer. There's lots more to say and lots more good questions from our audience. Sorry, you challenged us. Maybe we do have to come back together at the end of the Daf Yomi cycle and revisit some of these questions. I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us. Take care, be well,